It was just a family photography. Until historians zoomed in on the mother's hand. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 20 years examining photographs in the basement archives of the National Museum of African American History. She'd seen thousands of images, faded tintypes, cracked daguerreotypes, portraits of people whose names had been lost to time. But on a humid Tuesday morning in August, one photograph stopped her cold. The image showed a black family of 7, formally posed in front of a wooden house. The year, written in faint pencil on the back, read 1902. The father stood tall on the left, his hand resting protectively on a chair. 5 children arranged themselves in descending height. The oldest girl, maybe 16, wore a white dress with careful pleats. The youngest boy, no more than 4, clutched a wooden toy. And in the center sat the mother. She was the axis around which the family oriented. Her face was striking, high cheekbones, eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera lens and into Sarah's own. She wore a dark dress with a high collar, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her hands rested in her lap, one over the other, fingers interlaced. Sarah had been cataloging donated collections, this one from an estate sale in rural Mississippi. Most of the photos were unremarkable, documentation of lives lived and forgotten. But something about this image made her pause. She couldn't say what exactly, just an instinct honed by years of looking, really looking at the faces of the past. She reached for the magnifying glass she kept on her desk and brought the photograph closer to the lamp. The light caught the details, the texture of the father's jacket, the scuff marks on the children's shoes, the grain of the wooden porch behind them. Then she moved the glass over the mother's hands. Her breath caught. There, barely visible in the original photograph, but undeniable under magnification, were marks on the woman's wrists. Raised tissue, discolored skin, the unmistakable pattern of scarring. Sarah had seen similar marks before in photographs and drawings from the antebellum period. They were the signature left by shackles, by iron cuffs worn for so long they'd carved themselves into flesh. But this photograph was from 1902. Slavery had been abolished in 1865, 37 years earlier. Sarah's hands began to tremble as she held the magnifying glass. Something was terribly wrong with this picture. Sarah set down the magnifying glass and stared at the photograph, her mind racing. She'd documented hundreds of post-emancipation images, proud families in their Sunday best, veterans of the Union Army, freedmen and women building new lives. Never had she seen shackle scars on someone photographed decades after abolition. She picked up the photo again, examining every detail. The family appeared prosperous, or at least not impoverished. The house behind them, though simple, was well maintained. The children's clothing, while not expensive, was clean and carefully pressed. The father's posture suggested dignity, not defeat. This wasn't a family in bondage, not visibly anyway, but those scars told a different story. Sarah reached for her phone and called Marcus Webb, a colleague who specialized in Reconstruction-era documentation. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus, I need you to look at something," she said, skipping pleasantries. "Can you come down to the archives?" 20 minutes later, Marcus stood beside her desk, studying the photograph through the magnifying glass. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something darker. "My God," he whispered. "Those are shackle scars." "I know. But the date?" 1902. I checked it 3 times. Marcus straightened, running a hand over his face. "Sarah, you know what this could mean." She did. Historians had documented cases of illegal bondage continuing well after emancipation, convict leasing programs that were slavery by another name, peonage systems that trapped black families in debt servitude, isolated rural areas where the law simply didn't reach. But physical evidence like this was rare. Most victims had died without their stories being recorded. Most perpetrators had never faced justice. "We need to find out who she was," Sarah said. Marcus nodded slowly. "Where did this come from?" "Estate sale, Greenwood, Mississippi. The collection belonged to someone named Howard Patterson. Died last year. No living relatives. His belongings were auctioned off, and a dealer bought the photos, then donated them to us." "Greenwood." Marcus pulled out his phone and began typing. "That's Delta country. Cotton plantations, sharecropping, convict leasing. After the war, it was one of the worst places in the South for black folks." Sarah turned the photograph over again, looking for any identifying information. Just that penciled date. No names, no location beyond what they could guess. The house, the clothing, the formal composition, they all suggested this was an important occasion. Families didn't commission professional photographs lightly in 1902. It cost money, it required planning. So why would a woman bearing the scars of slavery agree to be photographed unless she had no choice, or unless she wanted the evidence preserved? "We're going to find her story," Sarah said quietly, "whatever it takes." The Mississippi State Archives occupied a modern building in Jackson, but its contents reached back centuries. Sarah and Marcus arrived on a Friday morning, armed with the photograph, the date, and the location. Greenwood, Mississippi, 1902. The head archivist, an older white woman named Dorothy Fletcher, led them to a research room lined with metal shelves. "Oh, wait. Greenwood records from that period are spotty," she warned. "The courthouse burned in 1906, lost a lot of county records. But we've got census data, some church registries, plantation ledgers. What exactly are you looking for?" Sarah laid the photograph on the table. "We're trying to identify this family, specifically the woman in the center." Dorothy put on her reading glasses and studied the image. Her expression didn't change when she saw the scars. Sarah wasn't sure if she'd noticed them. 7 people, 1902, Dorothy said. "That'll be the 1900 census. Let me pull those records for LeFlore County." She disappeared into the stacks. Marcus leaned close to Sarah. "You think she'll help us?" "She's a professional. She'll help us find the records. Whether she'll help us understand what they mean?" Sarah shrugged. Dorothy returned with 3 large leather-bound ledgers. "These are transcriptions of the 1900 census for LeFlore County. Original documents are in Washington, but these copies should have what you need. You're looking for a family of 7, 2 adults, 5 children?" "That's right." "Black family?" "Yes." Dorothy opened the first ledger. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, names and ages and occupations recorded in fading ink. She ran her finger down the columns. Most black families in LeFlore County in 1900 were sharecroppers or farm laborers. If this photograph was taken in 1902, the family might have been listed at a different address in 1900, but the names should match. They worked in silence for an hour, searching through page after page. Sarah's eyes began to blur with the repetitive entries. Jackson, Thomas, age 42, farmer. Wife, Mary, age 38. Children, Samuel, James, Ruth. Then Marcus said, "Wait." Sarah looked over his shoulder. He'd found an entry that made her pulse quicken. Thomas, William, age 35, farm laborer. Wife, Ruth, age 31. Children, Clara, age 15, James, age 13, Samuel, age 11, Mary, age 8, Joseph, age 3. 5 children. The ages matched the photograph almost exactly, accounting for 2 years' difference. William and Ruth Thomas. But it was the notation in the margin that made Sarah's breath catch. Written in different ink, added later, were 2 words. "Held illegally." Dorothy Fletcher leaned over Marcus's shoulder, her eyes narrowing behind her reading glasses. "That's unusual," she said slowly. "I've never seen a notation like that in census records." Sarah photographed the page with her phone, making sure the margin note was clearly visible. What could "held illegally" mean? "In 1900? Dorothy straightened, her expression troubled. "Could mean several things. Peonage, debt slavery, convict leasing, or..." She hesitated. "Or it could mean exactly what it says. Someone was being held against their will." "It is." Marcus flipped back a page, then forward several more, scanning the entries. "Are there other families with similar notations?" "Not that I've seen in 40 years of working here," Dorothy admitted. "But these transcriptions were made in the 1930s by WPA workers. Some of them were black folks who'd lived through that era. If they added notes, they had reasons." Sarah pulled out the photograph again, studying Ruth Thomas's face with new understanding. "We need to find out what happened to them. Are there any other records? Tax documents, property deeds, court cases?" Dorothy thought for a moment. "There's a collection of letters and documents from the Freedmen's Bureau, though most of their work ended by 1872, but..." She paused, something shifting in her expression. "There's something else. Private papers from the Whitmore family. They owned a plantation near Greenwood, and the collection includes correspondence, financial records, that sort of thing. It's not fully cataloged. We're still working through it." "The Whitmore family?" Marcus repeated. "Were they planters?" "Before the war, yes. Major cotton operation. After emancipation, they transitioned to a sharecropping system. But there were rumors..." Dorothy's voice dropped. "My grandmother worked as a teacher in Greenwood in the 1940s. She used to tell stories about families that never left certain farms, even decades after slavery ended. Folks who worked the land but never earned their freedom. She called them held-over people." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. Held-over people. People who were supposed to be free but weren't. The Whitmores were one of the families mentioned in those stories. "Can we see those private papers?" Marcus asked. Dorothy nodded slowly. "Follow me." She led them deeper into the archives, through a door marked "Processing Room." Inside, cardboard boxes lined metal shelves, each labeled with dates and collection names. Dorothy climbed a rolling ladder and retrieved a box marked "Whitmore Family Papers, 1870, 1920. She set it on the table with a heavy thud. "No one's looked at this in years. Be careful. Some of these documents are fragile." Sarah and Marcus opened the box together. Inside were bundles of letters tied with string, ledgers with brittle pages, and loose documents yellow with age. Sarah lifted out a ledger and opened it carefully. The entries were financial records, cotton sales, equipment purchases, and her heart sank, payments listed under labor accounts. Each account had a name, and beside each name a running tally of debts and credits that never seemed to balance. Near the bottom of one page, she found it. Thomas Ruth, balance owed $347, and beside it, in red ink, held pending payment. The ledger entry opened a door into darkness. Sarah and Marcus spread the Whitmore papers across the research table, sorting them by date. Dorothy brought them cotton gloves to protect the fragile documents and then quietly excused herself, as if sensing they needed space for what they were about to uncover. Marcus found the letters first. They were bundled together with twine, addressed to James Whitmore from various business associates, county officials, and family members. He untied the bundle carefully and began reading aloud. "This one's dated April 1898, he said. "Dear James, I trust you've resolved the situation with the labor shortage. My overseer tells me you found a solution to keep the Thomas woman on your property, despite her protestations. I've had similar success with the Davis family. As long as we control the commissary and the ledgers, these people have nowhere to go. The law is on our side. They owe us money, and until they pay, they stay." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. They were trapping them with debt. Marcus continued reading. Another letter, this one from July 1899. "The Thomas woman attempted to leave again last week. My men brought her back before she reached the county line. I've increased her debt by $50 for the trouble and cost of retrieval. Her husband understands the consequences if she tries again. The children are good workers, the oldest girl especially. They'll be useful for years yet." Sarah felt physically sick. She reached for another bundle of papers and found what appeared to be a contract. The heading read, "Labor Agreement between James Whitmore and William Thomas, January 1st, 1896. The terms were predatory. William Thomas had agreed to work Whitmore's land in exchange for housing, food, and supplies purchased from Whitmore's commissary. But the prices charged at the commissary were astronomical, triple what they'd be in town. And the contract stipulated that the Thomas family couldn't leave until their debt was paid in full. The fine print was even worse. In the event of attempted departure while debt remains outstanding, the undersigned agrees to compensate the landowner for losses incurred, including but not limited to cost of pursuit, lost labor, and damages to property and business reputation, such costs to be added to existing debt." It was a trap with no exit. "This is peonage," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "It was illegal, but sheriffs and judges looked the other way. Hell, sometimes they were in on it." Sarah kept searching through the papers. She found bills of sale for supplies supposedly provided to the Thomas family. Flour, cornmeal, fabric, tools. The prices were absurd. A sack of flour that would cost 50 cents in town was listed at $3. A pair of work boots, $10, and every purchase was added to their debt. Then she found something that made her stop breathing. A letter dated November 1901 from James Whitmore to a man named Samuel Reed, who identified himself as a U.S. Deputy Marshal. "Deputy Reed," Sarah read aloud, her voice shaking. "I write to inform you that I am holding a Negro woman named Ruth Thomas on my property. She claims to have been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but I have legal documents proving she owes me substantial money. She bears marks from her previous condition. Shackles, she says, from before the war. I keep her contained for her own protection and to ensure debt payment. Her family works my land. If you have concerns, I invite you to inspect my operation. You'll find everything in legal order." "My God," Marcus whispered. "Ruth was enslaved before the war. She still bore the scars. And after emancipation, Whitmore trapped her family in debt bondage." Sarah's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Ruth Thomas had survived slavery, survived the war, survived emancipation, only to find herself trapped again, this time by contracts and ledgers instead of chains. But there was still no explanation for the photograph. Why would Ruth Thomas sit for a formal portrait while being held illegally? The answer came in the next letter Sarah opened, and it changed everything. The letter was different from the others, shorter, written in hurried script on cheaper paper. It was dated March 1902 and addressed to James Whitmore from a photographer named Albert Shaw in Memphis, Tennessee. "Mr. Whitmore," Sarah read, "per your request, I will arrive in Greenwood on April 12th to photograph your property and laborers for your business records. My fee remains $25 for a day's work, including up to 12 photographs. I will bring my equipment by train. Please arrange transport from the station." Marcus looked up sharply. Whitmore commissioned the photograph. "For business records," Sarah said, understanding dawning. He was documenting his laborers, his property essentially, proof of his workforce for investors or partners. But that doesn't explain why Ruth would sit for it. Unless, Marcus trailed off thinking, unless she wanted to be photographed, evidence. proof of what was being done to her. They kept searching. The next document was a torn piece of paper, crumpled and smoothed out again, covered in different handwriting, rougher, less educated, but clear enough to read. It appeared to be a draft of a letter never sent, found among Whitmore's papers. Marcus read it aloud. My name is Ruth Thomas. I was born into slavery in 1869 in Alabama. I was freed by law in 1865, but I was only a child and didn't understand. My mother died when I was 12. I married William Thomas in 1884. We came to Mississippi looking for land to sharecrop. Mr. James Whitmore told us we could work his land and save money to buy our own place. That was a lie. He keeps us here. He says we owe him money we can never repay. He knows I bear the marks of slavery. He has seen the scars on my wrists from when I was a child. He uses this as proof that I was his property before the war, though I never belonged to his family. When I try to leave, his men bring me back. My children work his fields. We are not free. This is slavery by another name. Someone must know. Someone must help us. If you find this, please... The letter ended there, incomplete. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the fragile paper. She was trying to document her situation. She was trying to get word out. They searched more frantically now, looking for what happened next. The answer came in a county sheriff's report dated June 1902, filed among Whitmore's papers, perhaps kept as proof of his complaint. The report stated that William Thomas had been arrested for theft of property from James Whitmore's plantation. The property in question: 1 mule, 2 sacks of seed corn, various tools, and cash money totaling $14. William Thomas was sentenced to 6 months hard labor on a county work gang. They arrested the husband, Marcus said, probably trumped up charges to punish the family for Ruth's resistance. But attached to the sheriff's report was something unexpected. A second report, dated July 1902, from a federal investigator named Thomas Morrison, sent by the Justice Department to investigate claims of peonage in Mississippi. Morrison's report read, I interviewed the Thomas family on July 8, 1902. The woman, Ruth Thomas, showed me marks on her wrists consistent with restraints. She stated she and her family were being held against their will by James Whitmore through an illegal debt bondage system. Her husband had been arrested on questionable charges. I found evidence of predatory contracts and inflated commissary prices. I'm recommending federal prosecution of James Whitmore for violations of the Peonage Abolition Act of 1867. A federal investigator, Sarah breathed. Someone came. But the next document was a letter from a Justice Department official in Washington, dated September 1902. Investigation closed due to lack of sufficient evidence and local resistance to federal intervention. No prosecution recommended. They'd come so close. Someone had listened, someone had tried to help, but it hadn't been enough. Sarah sat back in her chair, the weight of the story pressing down on her. They had fragments. The census notation, the ledgers, the letters, the failed investigation, but they still didn't know how the story ended. What happened to Ruth Thomas and her family? Dorothy Fletcher returned to the research room carrying a thin folder. I thought of something, she said. We have a collection of newspaper clippings from the Greenwood Commonwealth, 1900 to 1910. If there was a federal investigation, even if it failed, sometimes local papers reported on it, especially if they wanted to spin the story their way. She opened the folder and spread out yellowed newspaper clippings, each one carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Most were mundane, advertisements, obituaries, reports of cotton prices. But then Sarah saw it. A small article, dated October 1902, headline reading, Local farmer cleared of peonage claims. The article was brief and dismissive. Mr. James Whitmore of Whitmore Plantation has been fully exonerated of baseless federal accusations regarding the treatment of his Negro laborers. Mr. Whitmore has always operated within the bounds of the law and maintains only fair and legal labor contracts. The federal investigator who raised these spurious claims has been reprimanded for wasting government resources. Mr. Whitmore's reputation as a fair and honorable employer remains unblemished. They buried it, Marcus said bitterly, and they protected Whitmore. But Sarah was looking at something else, a small notice in the corner of the same newspaper page, almost hidden among classified advertisements. Farm family seeking new situation. Experienced cotton workers. 7 members. William Thomas, apply at Greenwood Telegraph Office. Her heart began to race. They got out. Look, this is dated 2 weeks after the article about Whitmore. They left. Marcus leaned closer. But how? If Whitmore had them trapped? The photograph, Sarah said suddenly, everything clicking into place. The federal investigation failed, but Ruth Thomas knew someone was paying attention. She sat for that photograph in April 1902. She made sure her scars were visible. She documented herself, evidence that she bore the marks of slavery while supposedly free. When the investigator came in July, she showed him the photograph. And even though the Justice Department closed the case, The photograph existed. Evidence. Proof. Whitmore must have realized how dangerous it was. If that photograph got into the wrong hands, if it reached newspapers in the North, if it sparked renewed federal attention, he could face real consequences. So he let them go. Dorothy was nodding slowly. It makes sense. By 1902, there was growing national attention on peonage in the South. The progressives were pushing for reform. One photograph like that, showing a woman with shackle scars decades after emancipation, could have destroyed him. Sarah held up the photograph again, looking at Ruth Thomas's face with new understanding. She saw it now, the defiance in her eyes, the way she'd positioned her hands deliberately in her lap, wrists exposed. Ruth Thomas hadn't just sat for this photograph. She'd weaponized it. She saved her family, Sarah whispered. But where did they go? Marcus asked. The telegraph office notice was the thread they pulled next. If the Thomas family had left Greenwood in October 1902, there should be a trail. Census records, land deeds, church registries, something to show where they'd resettled. Dorothy helped them search through records from neighboring counties, then expanding outward across Mississippi. Nothing. The Thomas family seemed to have vanished from official records after 1902. It's not unusual, Dorothy explained. Black families who fled peonage situations often changed their names or moved far away to avoid being tracked down. Plantation owners sometimes sent men after escaped laborers, claiming they'd stolen property or owed debts. So they might not be Thomas anymore, Marcus said. Sarah felt frustration building. They'd come so far, uncovered so much, but the story still had no ending. What happened to Ruth? To William? To their 5 children? Clara, James, Samuel, Mary, Joseph? Then Marcus had an idea. The photograph. Where did it come from? Sarah pulled up her notes. Estate sale, Howard Patterson's collection. Greenwood, Mississippi. Why would Howard Patterson have a photograph of the Thomas family? They searched for information about Howard Patterson and found his obituary from the previous year in the Greenwood Commonwealth's online archives. Howard Patterson, 89, died peacefully at home. He was born in Greenwood in 1933, the son of Clara Patterson and grandson of Clara Thomas. Sarah's breath caught. Clara, that was the oldest daughter. They pulled Howard Patterson's family tree. His mother, Clara Patterson, married name, born Clara Thomas in 1887. Originally from Greenwood, moved to Memphis in 1902, married Albert Patterson in 1905. Albert Patterson, Marcus said slowly. Wait, Albert Shaw, the photographer. Did she change his name, or... They searched further and found the answer in a Memphis City directory from 1910. Albert Shaw, photographer, also known as Albert Patterson, following marriage to Clara Thomas in 1905. She married the photographer, Sarah said, amazed. The man who took the photograph that saved her family? The pieces fell into place rapidly after that. They found Albert Shaw's business records donated to the Memphis Public Library. In his journals, dated April 1902, he had written about his trip to Greenwood. Commissioned by James Whitmore to photograph his property and workers. Uncomfortable situation. The family seemed frightened. The woman in the center had terrible scars on her wrists. I felt I was documenting something wrong. Made 2 copies of the photograph. One for Whitmore, one I kept. Couldn't say why at the time, just felt I should. Later entries told the rest. July 1902. Received unexpected visit from federal investigator asking about photographs I'd taken in Greenwood. Provided my copy of the Thomas family portrait. He said it was evidence of illegal bondage. I'm glad I kept it. And finally, October 1902. The Thomas family arrived in Memphis today. They fled Greenwood. The oldest daughter, Clara, is 16, bright and strong like her mother. Her family is staying temporarily at the Freedmen's Aid Society shelter. I've offered to help them find work. 3 years later, Albert Shaw married Clara Thomas. They had 3 children. Clara lived until 1968, long enough to see the Civil Rights Act passed, long enough to tell her grandson Howard about the photograph that saved her family. Sarah knew what she had to do next. If Howard Patterson had died only a year ago, there might be other family members still living, descendants of Ruth Thomas who didn't know their ancestors' full story. She contacted the law firm that had handled Patterson's estate sale. After explaining her research, they connected her with Patterson's daughter, Diane Mitchell, who lived in Atlanta. 2 weeks later, Sarah and Marcus sat in Diane Mitchell's living room. She was in her early 60s, a retired schoolteacher with her grandmother Clara's strong features and direct gaze. I knew about the photograph, Diane said, holding the image carefully. My father kept it in a frame on his desk his whole life. He said it was the most important thing our family owned, but he never told me why, just that it was our history. Sarah laid out everything they'd found. The census records, Whitmore's ledgers, the letters, the investigation reports, Albert Shaw's journals. Diane's eyes filled with tears as she listened. My great-great-grandmother was held as a slave, even after emancipation. Yes, but she fought back. She documented what was being done to her family. When the federal investigator came, she had evidence ready. And even though the investigation was closed, the photograph she'd sat for, deliberately showing her scars, was powerful enough that Whitmore let them go rather than risk it becoming public. She saved them, Diane whispered, looking down at Ruth Thomas's face in the photograph. She was incredibly brave, Marcus added, and smart. She understood that evidence matters, that documentation matters. In a system designed to keep her voiceless, she made sure there would be proof. Diane wiped her eyes. What happened to them after they left? Sarah shared what they'd found. The Thomas family had settled in Memphis, lived in a Freedmen's Aid Society boarding house for 2 years, while William found work as a carpenter and Ruth worked as a seamstress. Clara met and married Albert Shaw. The other children grew up, married, had families of their own. Ruth and William lived long enough to see their grandchildren born. Ruth died in 1928, William in 1931. They built a good life, Sarah said. After everything they survived, they built something real and lasting. Diane was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph. Then she said, There are others, aren't there? Other families who were trapped like my ancestors? Other stories that were never told? Yes, Sarah said honestly. Peonage continued well into the 1940s in some places. Most victims never had the chance to document what happened to them. Most perpetrators never faced justice. Oh, then we have to tell this story, Diane said firmly. My great-great-grandmother sat for this photograph, so there would be evidence. We owe it to her to make sure people know. Sarah nodded. That's why we're here. With your permission, we'd like to include Ruth Thomas's story in a new exhibit at the National Museum of African American History. The photograph, the documents, everything. So people understand that emancipation wasn't the end of the struggle. For families like yours, freedom had to be fought for again and again. Diane looked down at Ruth Thomas's face one more time, at the woman who'd survived slavery as a child, who'd borne the scars for life, who'd been trapped again after emancipation but refused to be silenced. Yes, Diane said, tell her story, tell the world. 6 months later, the exhibition opened at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. It was titled, After Emancipation, The Struggle for True Freedom, and Ruth Thomas's photograph was the centerpiece. The exhibition hall was packed for the opening. Diane Mitchell stood beside the large display featuring her great-great-grandmother's portrait, surrounded by her own children and grandchildren. Beside the photograph, text panels explained Ruth's story. Her birth into slavery, her survival into emancipation, her entrapment through peonage, and her courageous act of documentation that ultimately freed her family. The original documents were displayed in climate-controlled cases: Whitmore's predatory contracts, Ruth's unfinished letter, the federal investigator's report, Albert Shaw's journal entries. Each piece of evidence told part of the story. Together, they revealed a truth many Americans still didn't know. Sarah stood to the side, watching visitors move through the exhibition. She saw people stop in front of Ruth's photograph, lean close to examine the scars on her wrists, and then read the explanatory text with expressions of shock and anger. A young black woman stood in front of the display for a long time, tears running down her face. Finally, she turned to her friend and said, I never knew. They never taught us this in school. I thought slavery ended in 1865. That's why this matters, Marcus said quietly, appearing beside Sarah. People need to know the truth. Emancipation was a beginning, not an ending. The exhibition had already sparked renewed interest in the history of peonage in the American South. Historians were combing through archives in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, looking for other cases, other families trapped in debt bondage decades after slavery supposedly ended. News articles had been written, documentaries were being planned, and most importantly, descendants of other peonage victims were coming forward with their own family stories. Diane Mitchell gave a speech at the exhibition opening, standing beside the photograph of her great-great-grandmother. Her voice was steady and strong. Ruth Thomas wanted the world to know what was being done to her family, she said. She sat for this photograph in 1902, knowing it might be the only evidence that would survive. She showed her scars deliberately, proof that she had been enslaved as a child and was being enslaved again as an adult. Decades after the law said she should be free. She was brave, she was strategic, she refused to be erased. Today we honor her courage, we tell her story, and we acknowledge the countless other families who suffered similar injustices, but didn't have the chance to document their pain. This photograph is not just my family's history. It's America's history, and we must reckon with it. The applause was long and heartfelt. Later, as the crowd thinned, Sarah stood alone in front of Ruth Thomas's photograph. She looked at the woman's face, those eyes that had stared down the camera lens 123 years ago, that had witnessed slavery and survival and resistance. Ruth Thomas had understood something fundamental, that history only remembers what is documented, that justice requires evidence, that the truth must be preserved even when it's painful. The photograph had seemed ordinary at first, just a family portrait, 7 people posed in front of a house. But when Sarah had zoomed in and seen those scars, everything changed. One image had revealed a hidden history of injustice, courage, and survival. Ruth Thomas's scars had told a story that could not be silenced. And now, finally, the world was listening.